Welcome to Lesson 17.3, the process of speciation. In this lesson, we'll identify the types of isolation that can lead to the formation of new species and describe the current hypothesis about Galapagos finch speciation. A species is a population or group of populations whose members interbreed and produce fertile offspring. Interbreeding permits any genetic change that occurs to spread throughout populations of a species. If some members of a population stop breeding with other members, the species gene pool can split, as shown in the figure. Once members of two populations stop interbreeding, changes in one gene pool cannot spread to the other. When this happens, we say that reproductive isolation has occurred. So what happens when populations become reproductively isolated? They may evolve into two separate species through speciation. Reproductive isolation can develop in several ways, including behavioral isolation, geographic isolation, and temporal isolation. If two populations that were once able to interbreed evolve differences in courtship rituals or other behaviors, behavioral isolation can occur. For example, eastern and western meadowlarks are similar birds whose habitats overlap. But members of the two species will not mate with each other, partly because they use different songs to attract mates. Eastern meadowlarks don't respond to a western meadowlark song, and vice versa. When two populations are separated by geographic barriers, such as rivers, mountains, or bodies of water, geographic isolation occurs. The Albert's squirrel, shown in the picture, lives in the southwest. About 10,000 years ago, a small population became isolated on the north rim of the Grand Canyon. Separate gene pools formed. Genetic change that appeared in one group were not passed to the other. Natural selection and genetic drift worked separately on each group and led the formation of a distinctive subspecies, the kabob squirrel. The Alberts and kabob squirrels are very similar, indicating that they are closely related. However, the kabob squirrel differs from the Albert squirrel in significant ways, such as fur coloring. What geographic barrier separates the two populations of squirrels? The Grand Canyon. Geographic barriers do not always guarantee isolation. Floods, for example, may separate lakes, enabling their fish populations to mix. If those populations still interbreed, they remain a single species. Also, a geographic barrier may separate certain organisms, but not others. A large river may keep squirrels and other small rodents apart, but probably won't isolate bird populations. A third isolating mechanism, known as temporal isolation, happens when two or more species reproduce at different times. For example, suppose that three similar species of orchids live in the same rainforest. Each species has flowers that last only one day and must be pollinated on that day to produce seeds. Because the species bloom on different days, they cannot pollinate one another. What is the current hypothesis about Galapagos finch speciation? Well, according to the current hypothesis, speciation in Galapagos finches occurred by founding of a new population, geographic isolation, changes in the new population's gene pool, behavioral isolation, and ecological competition. Many years ago, a few finches from South America, species M in the figure, arrived on one of the Galapagos Islands. These birds may have gotten lost or been blown off course by a storm. Once on the island, they survived and reproduced. Because of the founder effect, allele frequency of this founding finch population could have differed from allele frequencies in the original South American population. How might genetic drift, specifically the founder effect, have contributed to genetic variation in finch populations on different islands? Only a few finches are likely to have crossed to other islands from the first island the finches inhabited. Their allele frequencies could have differed by chance from those of finches on the first island. The island's environment was different from the South American environment. Some combination of the founder effect, geographic isolation, and natural selection resulted in differential reproductive success, adaptation, and evolution of this island population into a new species, species A shown in the figure. Later, a few birds of species A crossed to another island. Because these birds do not usually fly over open water, they moved from island to island very rarely. Thus, finch populations on the two islands were geographically isolated. The finch populations no longer shared a common gene pool. Over time, populations on each island further adapted to local environments. Plants on the first island may have produced small, thin-shelled seeds, whereas plants on the second island may have produced large, thick-shelled seeds. On the second island, directional selection would have favored birds with larger, heavier beaks. These birds could crack open and eat the large seeds more easily. So birds with large beaks would be better able to survive on the second island. Over time, natural selection would have caused that population to evolve larger beaks, forming a new population, B, with a new phenotype. So why did selection increase genetic variation among finches on the different islands? Different traits were selected because the islands had different environments. Imagine that a few birds from the second island cross back to the first island. Will population A birds breed with population B birds? Probably not. During courtship, these finches closely inspect a potential partner's beak. Finches prefer to mate with birds that have the same size beak as they do. Big-beaked birds prefer to mate with other big-beaked birds, and smaller-beaked birds prefer to mate with other smaller-beaked birds. Because the populations on the two islands have evolved differently sized beaks, they would probably not mate with each other. Differences in beak size combined with mating behavior could lead to reproductive isolation. The gene pools of the two bird populations remain isolated, even when individuals lived in the same place. The populations now have two distinct species. As these two new species live together on the first island, they compete for seeds. During the dry season, birds that are most different from each other have the highest fitness. That is because the more specialized birds experience less competition for certain kinds of seeds and other foods. Over time, the species evolve in a way that increases the differences between them. Birds on the first island that once belonged to species B may evolve into a new species, species C. These processes of geographic isolation, genetic change, and behavioral isolation could have repeated again and again across the Galapagos chain. Over many generations, natural selection could have produced the diversity among the 13 different finch species found there today. So how did selection lead to speciation? Likely, a speciation among the finches resulted from various combinations of geographic isolation and differences in phenotype, specifically in beak size, which correlated with different food sources. Even if two separate groups lived in the same area, their phenotypic differences would conceivably have been great enough to prevent them from mating with one another. Once populations become reproductively isolated, they are considered separate species. So, when members of a species share a gene pool and are separated for some reason, reproductive isolation occurs. Isolated gene pools diverge potentially into separate species.